Dr. Charlotte Smith's new day job. Charlotte's been in the new job for, I think, about 3 weeks, is the Modern Legal Records post-1750 specialist in the Collections Expertise and Engagement team at the National Archives. And before that, Charlotte was, and indeed continues as, Associate Professor in the School of Law at the University of Reading. And the lecture that we're about to hear, I understand, draws on research funded by the British Academy and the Leverhulme Trust. So we're grateful to both of them, and also to Charlotte, who will speak on Misadventures in Empire, the Colonial Bishoprics Fund, and the birth of the Worldwide Anglican Communion. Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just put the stop clock on to make sure I don't run over. So thank you everyone for joining us for what is, I'm sure, a fairly esoteric subject for a Wednesday night, and apologies if I get overly excited at points. I find this subject utterly fascinating, and that sits alongside the fact that I am now, as my day job, spending all day every day in archives, and that just makes me very happy. So I am a bit Tiggerish at the moment. Before I go any further, she's not in the room, but I need to acknowledge a debt of undying gratitude to the wonderful Sally Gold, who's been my research assistant on this project and has kept it going through a much pandemic afflicted year in academia, and this would not have been possible without her. It's work in progress. I'll get that caveat in early, and there is more to come. I think I would also put a health warning on this. If you have any particular delusions about the grandeur of the British Empire, or any sensitivities about potential criticisms of the way it was conducted, this is probably not the lecture for you. We're not going to empire bash, but we are going to tell a tale of time-honoured British pragmatism in combination with quite staggering ineptitude on occasion. So anyway, my starting point for this lecture is 2 quotes. The first of which is this by Robert E. Rhodes in his seminal work on law and modernisation in the Church of England. And he says, as the English settled in various parts of the world, they generally took with them their legal system and their church. But for the most part, they left behind the peculiar relationship between the one and the other. So a large part of this lecture is designed to unpick that simplistic or simple statement and look at how we arrived at that position and the complexities and historical vicissitudes that it masks. The second quote I have is from Geyer in his chapter on the First Lambeth Conference. And he said, even if still a defining facet of the English Church, the Crown has become Anglicanism's absent and largely forgotten centre. Its various claims have little place and no analogue in the wider Anglican communion today. And again, I want to kind of think about how we've ended up at that position, and to understand the difficulties of that and the tortured process by which we get there. And I'm using the Colonial Bishoprics Fund as a way of exploring these ideas, partly because, and I'll deal with this point very quickly in a minute, I think you can make a connection between the activities of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund and the formation of the Anglican Communion worldwide, but also because the Colonial Bishoprics Fund allows you to explore big ideas in empire in a concrete and manageable way. And obviously, if you're an ecclesiastical law aficionado, then it's interesting. So I will acknowledge at this point that in looking at the Colonial Bishoprics Fund, I do, tread in some fairly formidable footsteps, including Hilary Carey, Hardwick, and Rowan Strong. So, I have my work cut out, but I think what I want to do actually is to, and I know this is kind of a renegade action in the context of the Ecclesiastical Law Society, but I want to tow you out of familiar ecclesiastical waters and tow you out of the normal 19th century obsession with doctrinal battles and church parties and the usual arguments about church-state relations and all that jazz, and actually situate the formation of the Anglican Communion worldwide within the British approach to empire, and to explore like the messy realities of that, the legal and constitutional realities of that, and perhaps shed light that you don't often think about on those ecclesiastical developments. So without further ado, what was the Colonial Bishoprics Fund? Well, it's a fund formed primarily by voluntary subscription on the 27th of April 1841. It's formed by a meeting of clergy and laity at Lambeth Palace, which resolved that the Church of England, in endeavouring to discharge her duty to provide for the religious wants of her members in foreign lands, is bound to proceed upon her own principles of apostolical order and discipline. And then, and I'm quoting here, that the want of episcopal superintendence is a great and acknowledged defect in the religious provision hitherto made for colonies and dependencies of the British Crown, and that the acquisition of new colonies and the formation of new British communities in various parts of the world made it necessary that an immediate effort should be made to impart to them the full benefit of the church in all the completeness of her ministry, ordinances, and government. So for those reasons, a fund was to be raised towards the endowment of bishoprics in such foreign possessions as Great Britain had, in accordance with the determinations of the archbishops and bishops of the United Church of England and Ireland, who were to name treasurers. So that resolution led to Parliament passing the Bishops in Foreign Countries Act 1841, which authorised the church to create bishops for colonies in line with those purposes. And between 1841 and 1900, the Colonial Bishoprics Fund raises, I think I looked the figure up, 100 and, oh, it's nearly 2 million quid to endow colonial dioceses. It founds I've lost the number now. We found 67 new dioceses by 1900, either fully funded or part funded. And if we look at the breakdown of the donations for those endowments, about 20% of the funding comes from the SPG and SPCK. The bulk of the rest of it comes from private donors. We have big donors in this country, one of the most notable of whom is Angela Burdick Coots, who gives about £60,000 to endow several dioceses and 2 associated archdeaconries, and we'll never let anyone forget it. In many ways, this is, the Colonial Bishoprics Fund is one of her pet projects, and she bugs all and sundry about it when it doesn't go her way. And I love her for it, because she's one of the very few women you see alive in the records. Increasingly, money also comes from the colonies and churchmen and women in the colonies who are seeking to endow a bishopric for their area. So in the literature, we see lots of arguments about, the extent to which we can characterize the Colonial Bishoprics Fund as a success or a failure. People point to the amount of money raised, the number of bishoprics endowed. Equally, some people point to the fact that this was an elite project. It's not something really that normal people buy into. I'm not really interested in that. What really interests me is that when you look at the records, it looks very much like from 1841 to 1863, 66, everyone involved with the Colonial Bishoprics Fund seems to be, and I know this is contentious, but they seem to be working on the basis that what they're exporting into empire is some kind of Anglican establishment in all its pomp and glory. And then between 1863 and 1866, thanks to the kind offices of the incredibly litigious and argumentative Bishop Gray of Cape Town and Bishop Colenso of Natal, with some other factors, other participants, including the erstwhile Long, they find out that this isn't what they've been doing at all. In fact, the letters patent by which bishops had been appointed and which purported to confer coercive ecclesiastical jurisdiction over designated territories did no such thing. It was impossible in colonies which possessed representative self-government for the Crown, by an unsupported act of the prerogative, to create coercive jurisdiction. Ergo, Anglican establishment couldn't exist in those colonies. Huge shock and horror. It gets weirder than that, because actually there'd been a decision in 1857 to that, I think it's 1857, to that effect in the previous case of R and Eton College in King's Bench. But why does this matter? Well, I just think, how was it we raised so much, Anglicans raised so much money to endow these bishoprics. At least a significant proportion of the people involved in this project seem to have proceeded on the basis that what they were exporting was Anglican establishment, and then they figure out they're doing nothing of the sort, and it takes them quite a long time to figure that out. And then they're so anxious to get rid of Bishop Colenso of Natal that they try in Chancery to put a bomb under the whole enterprise by saying that the purposes of the trust have failed. You know, such as imperial history, it's full of these things. It's to exploring the kind of pathology of empire that leads to that position that most of my remaining time will be devoted. But before I go any further, I just want to deal with this lovely hostage to fortune that I offered, which is making the link between the formation of the Worldwide Anglican Communion we have today and the Colonial Bishoprics Fund. I make that connection not least because the founders and benefactors of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund made that connection. They were convinced that not only was Episcopal church government the best form of church government, but they also recognised that colonial churches could not grow to full spiritual maturity in conformity with the Book of Common Prayer without the presence of local bishops to baptise, confirm and ordain their members. So in a sense, I mean, there's an adage that where there's a bishop, there's a church, but equally, only by having bishops could you grow something that would become the Anglican Communion. Until then, you always had a situation where the church communities you planted overseas were kept in a state less than full spiritual maturity, and there was a perpetual inequality of relationship. So I'd note that actually this marches in line with the developments in colonial self-government within the British Empire at this period. So this idea that at least settler colonies should have representative self-government extended to them marches alongside this idea that what you should be doing is founding colonial churches that have the means of being fully functioning churches in accordance with the ecclesiology of the Church of England. Note too that there are ambiguities around this. It's kind of notable that many of the patrons, they are fully committed to this idea, but equally horrified by the idea that those spiritually mature churches might, you know, do things that aren't in accordance with their wishes or their reading of the doctrine and principles of the Church of England. And, you know, even government gets in on the act. So, for example, we have the Colonial Clergy Act of 1874, restricting the activities of clergy who are ordained outside of England. But we know that Gladstone, one of the key actors in the formation of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund, for example, he does deliberately make that link between the expansion of the colonial episcopate, growing fully mature churches in the fullness of time, and that marching alongside constitutional developments in empire. Anyway, I digress. In case I was feeling kind of anxious about making the link between the creation of bishoprics and the formation of the Anglican Communion. I'd look to the work of people like Jeremy Morris, who really note, and Carey too, who note that, you know, if we look at the Lambeth Conference as the heart of the sort of, well, the institutional heart of the Anglican Communion, then it's first and foremost a gathering of bishops. And it's the Colonial Bishoprics Fund that actually enables that expansion of the episcopate across empire. So to turn back to the Colonial Bishoprics Fund and its nature, a fair chunk of the existing literature in the ecclesiastical history canon is devoted to the argument about the nature of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund, and a lot of the existing accounts of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund would characterize it as an exercise in the manifestation and assertion of voluntary effort and spiritual autonomy on the part of a church that is frankly sick to death of the state not fulfilling its spiritual obligations, or perhaps in recognition of the fact that the state is no longer willing to fulfill those spiritual obligations. You know, it's the state has retreated from funding the activities of the church. If you're a high churchman at this period, the chances are you've spent many years basically saying that the American War of Independence would not have happened if we'd given them bishops. So the narrative runs, you know, the Colonial Bishoprics Fund is, you know, first and foremost a manifestation of voluntary effort to do something the state has previously done, and an assertion of the spiritual autonomy and authority of the church to take that step. And you can see elements of that. So its trustees are the bishops and archbishops of the Church of England and Ireland, as I've said. The largest amount of subscriptions given to it are coming from private donors. But I think its position, actually, once you get into the records, is much more ambiguous. I don't think that you can characterize it as a kind of pure and simple expression of voluntary effort. So, for example, look at its treasurers. By the time we get to 1866, when, and actually before this, you've got a list of treasurers who are, you know, the chances are they're involved because they're committed high churchmen and known as such, but actually they are also significant movers and shakers in the state. So you've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gladstone, future Prime Minister. You've got the Lord Chief Justice, John Duke Coleridge. You've got the Vice Chancellor and former and future Lord Chancellor, William Page Wood. There are clearly strong connections to the kind of corridors of power within the state. At the same time, I'd note that in the language which its adherents, its founders used to proclaim its objectives to justify the formation of the fund, those statements are suffused with the rhetoric of establishment and the arguments that are often made to advance establishment and to deride the possibility of leaving religious provision to voluntary effort. So you've got, this idea of the connection between the provision for the spiritual welfare of British peoples overseas, and the idea that that's what equips them to become the citizens of an enlightened and law-abiding state that can rise above governance by brute force. You've got ideas of Anglicanism and Christian doctrine of an Anglican character as underpinning the development of British character and values. All of these things shine through, again suggesting that it's not quite as simple as just saying, this is a purely voluntary effort which is focusing on the spiritual autonomy of the church and is retreating from its traditional relationship with the state. Equally, when we get to litigation around its endowments, those files end up in the Treasury Solicitor's office because of the involvement of the Crown in the livings involved. Similarly, Colonial Office officials are routinely involved in the affairs of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund and the mechanics of appointing and authorising the appointment of its bishops. So, the Colonial Office has got their fingers all over the decisions about, whether there is sufficient endowment to found a diocese and who might be appointed to that diocese. And look again, how are these bishops appointed? They're initially consecrated under the authority of letters patent, later by Crown mandate. So I suppose part of this lecture is contesting the link that's often made between the Colonial Bishoprics Fund and the development of voluntarism or voluntary effort in the Church of England. There is a link, but it's not uncontested and it's not unambiguous. And the reason for this is empire. Part of the complexity of this story derives from the British approach to the administration of empire. Now, part of it is plainly about ecclesiastical politics and the Anglican talent for divergence in matters theological, but I'm not really concerned with that today because there's lots of people in the virtual room who know that better than me. Actually, a huge amount of the complexity comes from the British approach to empire. Our starting point, if we're looking at the nature of legal governments and the transmission of law in empire, is Coke and Blackstone. So they say that the English common law is superior as a form of law, but territorial, and therefore does not automatically apply outside of the realm. For that, we look to Calvin's case in 1608 and to Blackstone's commentaries. So, the law governing a British colonial possession varied according to the nature of the colony and the mechanism by which it came into the British Empire. So, colonial possessions obtained by conquest or treaty retained their pre-existing laws and legal system until such time as it was modified or abolished. And to that existing legal system was added such new laws as might later be enacted or determined. Contrast that with the position of colonies which were deemed to have been acquired by settlement as previously empty land, or terra nullius. Those colonies, when settlers went there, they carried with them such as the common law and the incident constitutional rights as applied to their new situation, to which was added imperial and colonial statutes and crown orders and whatever else in the way of legal provision was made. So it's a pretty complicated system. It's not like a civil law empire where there is one approach to legal administration and it's rolled out across the empire. No. We're not going to do that. The resulting complexity is actually heightened by several other factors, which, the first of which is the variability of the institutions and mechanisms for government in those colonies. So, it's a truism that from about 1830 onwards, representative self-government is progressively rolled out to colonies with large settler communities. The same is not true in other colonies, where there is instead some kind of rolling out of autonomy, but a much stronger concern with preventing elites from exercising untrammeled authority. This impacts on the powers of the crown in respect of different colonies, so that there's a variability in the role of the crown and the intervention of the crown in colonial government from one place to the next. Equally, the legal landscape is changed by developments, for example, in the repugnancy laws, so that there is a move from a tendency to challenge colonial legislation on the basis that it's repugnant to English law, to a situation where you're trying to prevent that from happening, so that the Colonial Laws Validity Act in 1865 says colonial legislatures cannot pass laws which are repugnant to the laws of England, and so by implication everything else is valid. So the law begins to diversify, having started out pretty diverse. The resulting legal picture is enormously complex and heterogeneous. It encompasses a rich diversity of laws, legal systems, governance structures, and local arrangements, all of which are being administered by quite a small body of judges, particularly if you get to the highest level of appeal, then you're dealing with the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which doesn't even have its own unique judicial staff, and then civil servants sitting in the Colonial Office in London. Judith Rowbottom says they spent most of their time playing cricket, and there was 3 of them, and every so often there'd be a bit of a rush on in the office, and this is the way we administered our empire. And just in case you thought the situation wasn't complicated enough, let's just remember that a lot of this is being done in a distinctly kind of pragmatic common law way, in that, we develop things as we go along in individual circumstances and kind of make, do, and mend. Equally, many of the narratives upon which these kind of legal structures depend are themselves contested. So there is an argument actually that, you know, sometimes the history of a colony's coming into empire and the means by which that happened, you know, is not a straightforward and uncomplicated history in itself. So what do we have? We have a jerry-built empire. I told you if you admired the British Empire, this wasn't the talk for you. I'm serious. I do have a sneaking admiration for it. It's kind of a masterclass in how just to make things happen. It's a bit like how the Duke of Wellington characterized his military campaigns. He said, you know, I just tie a knot and carry on. This looks very much like what's happening. And we can see some tangible examples of this. So, for example, why were colonial bishops appointed by letters patent? That's because that's how we'd done it in Ireland. So, of course, everyone thought that was a good idea. But did anyone stop and think about the suitability of that process in respect of other colonial possessions? Did anyone stop and think about the odd position of Ireland in empire? Ireland is, you know, if you were plucking a colonial example off the shelf to duplicate, you would not choose Ireland because it's always had an ambiguous status as neither metropole nor true colony in the modern era. Nobody thinks about it. No one thinks about the suitability of the letters patent to how that might, you know, depend on the circumstances of individual colonies. So we have evidence of indiscriminate copying of letters patent without regard to the specific constitutional and legal circumstances of the colony concerned. The Judicial Committee of the Privy Council accused the Colonial Office of this. The Colonial Office get very upset and go, no, of course we didn't do that. But actually, if you look at the Colonial Office records, you can see that all letters patent basically traced to the same 5 root documents. And there doesn't seem to be a pattern to which was chosen in respect of which colony. I do literally think they were taking an example I prepared earlier off the shelf. There is incidentally, when the creation of coercive jurisdiction is held subsequently to be ineffective, a lovely panic about the potential of lots of invalid marriages performed by clergy who were not ordained by bishops having territorial jurisdiction within the Church of England. Again, you can see ad hoc developments in the process by which bishops are appointed. So the Colonial Office is very hands-on until letters patent fall as a way of doing things, despite the fact that this is supposed to be about voluntary effort and the state has withdrawn from active participation in other ways. There are other oddities. I'll mention just a couple. So Colenso is consecrated as Bishop of Natal and takes the oath of canonical obedience to Bishop Gray at a time when Bishop Gray has surrendered his own letters patent to enable his diocese to be divided. So the oath of canonical obedience is in fact invalid and ineffective. Nobody seems to have spotted that. No one spotted the case of R and Eton College, which stated a good sort of nearly 8 years before the litigation in Natal that the Crown couldn't create coercive jurisdiction. And then the final bizarre oddity of bizarre oddities, the letters patent creating or authorising the consecration of these colonial bishoprics, where do they put the final ecclesiastical appeal? Is it the High Court of Delegates? No. Is it the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council as the highest court of ecclesiastical appeal? No. No, they give the right of final appeal to the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is nowhere else. So we have a jerry-built empire with a very inconsistent approach, or kind of heterogeneous and gloriously varied approach to the transmission of law and legal arrangements. We also, I think, have an empire which plays out in grand scheme the joyous nature of constitutional change in an organic constitution, which is that actually there's huge variability of the acceptance and understanding of constitutional change as it happens. And this is taking place in a time of great constitutional change and in the context of an empire where the transmission of constitutional values and principles is not unproblematic. So, you know, there is a voluminous literature looking at the inconsistencies with which Britain in reality exported key constitutional doctrines versus the reality on the ground, and the kind of variability of that, but also equally the tendency of settler colonies to take what they wanted of constitutional development while rejecting and discarding the stuff that they didn't want. And we see this in perhaps the kind of variable acceptance, or the kind of staggered acceptance or failure to see the consequences of colonial self-government. We also see it in the litigation around the Colonial Bishoprics Fund in very starkly contrasting ideas of what the royal supremacy means. So take Colenso and Gladstone in Chancery Rolls Court. The Colonial Bishoprics Fund says without coercive jurisdiction, you cannot have the Church of England. You cannot have a Church of England bishop. And then you've got Romilly going, yeah, you can. The letters patent were effective to authorise consecration. All of the important features and functions and powers of being a bishop follow on consecration, and the royal supremacy still exists because you still vindicate the law and the doctrines of the church. You just have to do it in secular courts. So I am pretty much over time, but do you see, I think, you know, you can tell an ecclesiastical story about the Colonial Bishoprics Fund, but I think to properly understand what's going on and to kind of understand some of the difficulties we now have with figuring out, you know, the ongoing relationships between the churches of the Anglican Communion, you really need to understand the glorious messiness of the British Empire. And that's without talking about the way that, you know, and these are not abstract ideas. These are not kind of legal principles and happenings which happen by some mysterious divine means. They are things done by people and by networks of people, and those people pull in different directions, and they have different concepts of what they're doing, different understandings of what should be done, different interests. You know, it may well be that the founders of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund wanted it to act on voluntary principles and wanted it to be an assertion of spiritual autonomy. But to take just one example, many of its patrons clearly did not understand it that way. So is it anyone that you know, what we do with the legacies that have been left to us? Nothing is simple. I could probably talk for another hour, but you've had enough. But really, my kind of concluding thought would be that as a society, as a church, as we grapple with our apparent willful blindness to the legacies of empire and its realities, I think this is a handy reminder that actually it's not just about historical monuments in churches. It's also about the way in which, as a communion of churches, we hang together. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, for a fantastic lecture. You brought so much learning and historical research, and also your words are so replete with contemporary resonances, as you just touching on, and my mind is absolutely blown with some of the things that you've said, and sort of reassessing my thoughts about the royal supremacy and what it means, and those different interpretations in that 19th century context. So wow, thank you. Amazing stuff. Well, we have some time for questions, I hope, if you have some time, and we've got two ways of doing that. If people want to raise hands in the participants panel in Zoom to show that you want to ask a question, or if you prefer, write something in chat. I just want, well, I'll kick off, if I may, with a question you touched on right towards the end, Charlotte, there. I thought it was absolutely fascinating about different understandings of the royal supremacy, and especially you said some people were arguing, well, you can still exercise coercive jurisdiction, but you just have to use the secular courts to do it. And I mean, that's almost word for word what Article 37 talks about, the crown restraining the stubborn and evildoers by the civil sword, So it's almost like that's a truer doctrine of royal supremacy, arguably. So anyway, I find that really fascinating. I was just wondering whether, of course, the Episcopalians in America, they changed the word completely, rewrote the Article 37 to because of their doctrine of the separation of church and state. I was wondering, because most Anglicans still in some way sign up to saying generally across the world, they generally put some stock in the 39 articles. Was that part of this, was that article part of this conversation, this sort of doctrinal discussion of the royal supremacy? Was it something that was live and prominent? And was there any move at all in the colonial representative assemblies, any move to try and establish a church, and actually establish an Anglican church? So that's my question.
Okay, so you don't see debates about individual articles. What you do see and this is the concern of patrons like Angela Burdick Coots, is that these churches are going to go their own way and they're going to undermine the doctrinal unity of the communion of churches, because now, you know, without coercive jurisdiction, they're at liberty to do their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where Romilly is saying, no, don't be idiotic, okay? Just because you can't enforce the kind of, just because you don't have coercive power yourself, so you can't touch the endowments of a bishop yourself, doesn't mean you can't enforce your doctrinal standards. You just have to go to the civil court to do it. And that's a really effective way of maintaining doctrinal unity. And still to this day, whether or not a church is entitled to its historic endowments will stand or fall according to whether it holds itself to be bound to its historical doctrinal inheritance. And that, you know, so Romilly is basically going that just be practical about this. It's, you know, you don't have to worry about these churches going off on a frolic of their own. You just, you know, you just have to go to the civil power to do it. And, you know, ultimately, I'm sure they'll all behave because they all want their endowment. In actual fact, they don't all behave. Almost nowhere do you get a colonial legislature establishing legislation. Broughton in New South Wales would have quite liked them to, but his pleas fall on deaf ears. What you get instead is a string of bishops handing in their letters patent and essentially setting up as churches in communion with the Church of England, but not actually, you know, the Church of England in wherever it happens to be. So Selwyn starts the ball rolling in New Zealand and it goes from there. And even Broughton in New South Wales goes, I admit defeat. So ultimately, but it's not, I mean, I think, you know, you can talk about these big high level things. If you go to the archives, you can see these letters by, you know, particularly the Canadian bishops or, you know, Canadian churches going, tell us how we can authorize the consecration of a bishop. And so, you know, they've got to find some way of doing this. And they can't, it's very hard for them to entirely let go of those ideas that they've kind of inherited.
Brilliant, thank you. Really find that so fascinating. Thank you. We have a question indicated from Colin Buchanan. Bishop Colin, to ask you a question. Are you able to unmute?
I should be speaking now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm very grateful for the replies because we were getting actual instances. I felt I was itching a bit as you went through, wanting to hear actual instances of different ways in which the problems were handled in different provinces, and getting some instances in the replies rather helped me. But I wanted to ask an actual question of fact. You quoted the Colonial Clergy Act of 1874, and I think it was restricted the colonial clergy, but in fact, my understanding was it released them, that clergy ordained overseas could not minister at all within the Church of England by any at all. Even the American bishops at the First Lambeth Conference could not have presided at communion in the Church of England, and the 1872 Act opened the door, under conditions obviously, for folk ordained overseas to take part in England. Am I right about that?
Yeah, but there's massive tension over that. Sorry, I wasn't clear, but I mean, there is a huge debate over that, not least obviously because, you know, advanced high churchmen who are not getting things their own way are actually, you know, resorting to finding amenable colonial bishops to consecrate their candidate, or to ordain their candidates. There are real sensitivities over it, and you know that sits alongside a lot of probably unfair rhetoric about the caliber of the colonial clergy and the colonial bishops. And I delight in saying this because my own minister is a Bickerstaff, and I like to you know, tease him about his episcopal colonial forebears.
Thanks for that question and that answer. We also have a question from Norman Doe. Norman.
Hi there. Thanks ever so much, Russell. Charlotte, brilliant topic, absolutely brilliant paper. You've certainly towed us out from the calmer waters of ecclesiastical law into somewhat more turbulent waters. Loads of questions, but you say the fund was established in 1841, and the trustees, the composition of the trustees was bishops of the Church of England and Church of Ireland, the United Church of England and Ireland, of course. Now, in 1869-70, with the so-called disestablishment or the dissolution of that constitutional union of those churches, what happened to the Irish bishops? Were others enlisted onto the trustees? Were there any Welsh bishops? Were they remotely interested in this venture at all, given what was happening with the church in Wales in the second half of the 19th century? And after the Lambeth Conference of 1867, did you get representation, very topical today, did you get representation from the overseas churches, let's call them that, on the trustees of the fund?
I confess this is work still to be done. I kind of have got to 1866 and stopped, and I am guiltily aware that I have an entire, I have reams and reams and reams and reams of photographed documents still to go through. So
not a problem.
Give me 6 months and I'll have the answer.
As with the principles of Anglican canon law, I have a supplementary question, therefore. And you mentioned what was it called? The Colonial Laws Act of 1865. Was that the one? Did that touch in any way upon this question of the exportability of ecclesiastical law? Did it touch on ecclesiastical law or not?
No.
That's just before your cutoff date.
Yeah, and the whole issue of like how anyone can have thought that establishment was one of those things that got exported is a bit of an oddity, because I think Cook basically says, so way back when, establishment is not something that is exported. It just isn't. I think it's that triumph of like, you do things the way you're used to doing them and you work from what you know. And I think it's also like, you see, like on the one hand, you know, and we get this with disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, you know, on the one hand, the state is retreating and is embracing the voluntarist principle, and you can kind of make some possibly unfair arguments about Gladstone and his political capital and all of that. But when it comes to the crunch, there is a real kind of almost emotional reluctance to let go. And I think it's because you know, looking at some of the literature around British character and the idea of Britishness and the idea of, you know, how you build that into empire, you can't do that without Anglicanism. And so as much as the state is going, this is not our job, this is, you know, we are withdrawing, for people on the ground doing this stuff, they can't quite let go, because it is the link with the idea of Britishness and civilization and the British character is just innate. It's just there. And you know, there's been, Matt Grimley has done some wonderful work on you know, and there's other people as well, that the link between the sort of Anglican variety of Protestantism and the British character. And I think that's a big part of it. Like, it's almost like we're just not going to see, because we just can't see. You know, it's a weird exercise in just, you know, carrying on regardless.
Thank you, Charlotte. Excellent.
Great, thanks for the question, Norman. So we probably do have time for another question or two. There was another hand up earlier. I don't see it at the moment. So if anyone else wants to raise a question, do find that raise hand button in Zoom, something in the chat. But we've covered a huge amount of ground there, and clear from the questions we've had, Charlotte, you've excited a lot of us to think and reassess things that we perhaps thought that we knew. Well, I don't see any more hands up for the moment. Or yes, Norman. I will. Yes, Norman.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tony. It's so irresistible. I'm afraid it's such a flipping good topic. That's the thing, and your enthusiasm for it is utterly infectious. Just a little thing. At some point, I can't remember which Lambeth conference it was, but a resolution was passed. Others will know. A resolution was passed. It has no a binding legal authority, of course, across the Churches of the Communion, but it has a kind of quasi-legal quality. The resolution was passed that each church must become self-funding. Now, you haven't taken us to the end of the story with the fund, but that now actually is an assumption underlying the laws of all churches in the Anglican Communion, so much so that the Legal Advisors Network has included it amongst the principles of canon law, common to the churches of the Communion. But it's not, it's for each church to be self-sustaining financially. Now, have you come across any evidence when that principle starts to take shape? Around the sort of 1860s, 70s, as I say, I can't remember what year I'm thinking about of that resolution, but when does that principle, which is inimical, of course, to the fund concept, and is an expression in itself of provincial autonomy. So when do you think that principle starts to emerge? Thank you ever so much for the indulgence, Russell and Charlotte.
You see that really early on, actually. So I'm thinking the correspondence I know best relates to Australian bishoprics, because I wanted to go to Sydney, so I did a paper on the Bishop of Grafton and Armidale and got paid to go there as well. But already by the late 1850s, early 1860s, you've got the Colonial Office writing and saying, well, you know, there are not sufficient funds to endow a bishopric for this place, and basically almost setting targets for the colonial church itself in combination with the Colonial Bishoprics Fund to raise the requisite endowment. I think that I think there was a rule of thumb that you had to raise £1,000. But then what you get is, and you can see these in the Fulham Palace papers, so you'll get these to and fro's where you know, the bishop who wants his diocese divided will be writing and saying, you know, we've raised this much money from these sources and this is how it can be done, and you know, we've shown willing. So actually that comes very early, but you also then, you know, that changes the dynamic of the appointments process, because then for as much as the colonial office or, you know, the staff of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund think that they have a right to work out between them who the appointed person should be, you've got settler communities going, oh no, we want this person, or we want that kind of person. We don't. And you know, Grafton and Armadale is wonderful because, you know, they get the first bishop is foisted upon them and is a disappointment to everyone, and then has the, well, you know, it depends on how you view this, but he has the misfortune or perhaps the lucky of escape of drowning, fording a river on his first visitation. So and everyone in the colony kind of goes, phew, got rid of a bad one.
Thank you ever so much. I see that Stephen is, I'll switch off now.
Yes, we've got another question. Thanks for that question. Stephen Leon, would you like to ask your question?
It was really to continue slightly what Norman had said about this not being the end of the story. The Colonial Bishopric Fund morphed into the Overseas Bishopric Fund for very obvious reasons in terms of its name. And I've been secretary of the Overseas Bishopric Fund for the last 20 years. And what I learned tonight was that the messiness of both Empire and the Colonial Bishoprics Fund is still something that plagues us in terms of the trustee responsibility for the Overseas Bishopric Fund. But having said that, we also are in the position of being able to, or being asked to administer what is now around just over £18 million worth of capital for the good of supporting the ministry of bishops throughout the Anglican Communion. And it's very clear from our perspective that while self-sufficiency is an ideal that the Anglican Communion has for all its provinces, there are some areas of the Anglican Communion that are never, or at least for the foreseeable future and beyond, going to be self-sufficient. But the history of the fund is quite interesting. We've done a lot of work in the last 5 to 6 years on trying to rationalize the number of funds that there are, because the Overseas Bishopric Fund is a bit of a misnomer, because when I became secretary of it, I think there were 72 separate funds under that umbrella. And we've now brought it down to round about 26 or 28. But you've got some funds, for example, Hong Kong, Singapore, 2 in Canada, 2 in Australia, where it wasn't too difficult to persuade the bishops there and then to persuade the Charity Commission that they really no longer needed the support of the OBF. And so we were able to put that money into the general fund. But I think I really just wanted to make a comment rather than a question, and that was that out of the messiness of what the Colonial Bishoprics Fund left, if you like, within the Anglican Communion, despite the fact that it raises a number of questions for us, it does put the OBF in a position where it can do an enormous amount of good support for the Office of Bishops throughout the Anglican Communion.
Thank you for that. We have to talk more sometime. I love that it's still there doing its thing.
Indeed, and wonderful to hear that that update, as you say, Charlotte, from Stephen there. Well, there are no more questions, so I think that probably means it's time to wrap up. I just want to say there are no more online lectures planned by the Society now until September, but you can always sign up as early as you like. There are some in-person lectures and events on our events page on the website, and more events of both kinds will be added in the coming months. Meanwhile, you can catch up on our YouTube channel with previous events, and more will be added to YouTube in the next few days of other recent events. And those who've been with us this evening, for whom it's their first event, or if you aren't a member, do consider please joining the Society. Want to thank Canon Norman Boakes for assisting with the tech and the hosting this evening, and to everybody for participating, but most of all, of course, to Charlotte for your lecture, Charlotte, which we've heard in the questions, the how many ideas it's fired off in our minds, and the excitement that it's generated, and in particular, it's been so obvious it's not this dusty and dry corner of some sort of irrelevant history, but you know, your work that you've shared with us is really addressing important ecclesiological questions of how and why did we get where we are, and you know, it seems to me just such a really profound example of how ecclesiastical law can help to answer that question. And we've heard how the topics you've raised still speak so directly to the church today. So thank you for all the time and care you've put in putting your presentation together, and for talking with us this evening. It's been a great pleasure. Good night, everyone.